Imagine music is playing right now. Do 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 do. Hey everyone, and welcome to Let's Pod This. We're so glad you're here with us today. It's a beautiful, sunny Friday afternoon in Oklahoma. I'm joined by two lovely people. Scott Melson, hello, sir.
Dude, can we make our theme music "It's a Beautiful Day" by U2?
We
Because that
cannot, because unless you know Bono personally. Also, that would not fit the motif of our episodes every week, right? There were plenty of weeks, including like 2 weeks ago. Yeah, that's exactly right. And
no,
that
it's
voice you hear,
beautiful.
of course, that voice you hear is Bailey Perkins. Hello, ma'am.
Hello, Andy. Hey, listeners.
Thank you all for being here with us. Well, folks, we've passed the bill filing deadline for 2021. A record number of bills were filed, I think close to 3,050, which is exceptional. And so, like many folks, I've spent the last roughly 22 hours sorting through bills. I have about 115 on my list right now, which is way more than we've ever had on there. Oh, maybe it's more than that now. And I'm just looking at bills that are related to elections, voting, redistricting, initiative petitions, ethics, and Open Meeting Act, Open Record Act, and then a few other miscellaneous ones. And so our topic for today is going to be talking about some of these bills. We'll mention some of the silly ones that will probably go nowhere, that are good for a news hit that we've already seen come out. We'll talk about the ones that are under the radar that will probably be very important but haven't yet been discussed in many cases because they don't yet have bill language in the body. And then we'll talk about what the three of us are paying attention to. But listeners, we would love to hear from you about what your priorities are. And so before we get into it, I want to say, if you haven't already joined the Let's Fix This mailing list, our email list, please do. You can go to our website, letsfixthis.org, scroll to the bottom, sign up right there. And I don't even send one once a week because we're all busy. But over the next few days, I'm going to, probably early next week, I'm going to send out a survey asking you about your priorities and about what issues matter to you. A very short, like SurveyMonkey style thing. And I would love to hear from you. So if you haven't already joined our email list, please do, so you can be sure to respond to that survey. I'll also put it out on social media, though, because I always like to get a good sample response. So,
and Andy, it's a good time to remind listeners as well that there are 3,500 bills out there. It doesn't mean that 3,500 bills are going to go through the process. And so you're going to read over the next week or two headlines from journalists and news stations and advocates about the different pieces of legislation that have been filed. Some of them might sound really outrageous. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to move through the process, but if you see something that draws concern for you or that you really like, definitely reach out to the bill author to express your concern or your excitement, but also reach out if you know what committee that bill has been assigned to, express your concern or your excitement to that committee chair as well, because they make or break which bills get on agendas and which ones don't. And so
that's exactly right. I spoke to Leader Eccles last night, and he said, this weekend, especially on Sunday, he has blocked out the whole day for him and his staff to go through all these bills because they have to start assigning them to committees. And that is as overwhelming as it feels to us. Like, we're all looking at kind of specific niches of the bills, but for leadership, they have to look at all of them and point them into the right committee. And they've got I think a record number of committees this year too, right?
They do.
they created new committees
But they can also, any bill that they're like, I don't really want to. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know where it should go, and also we don't really want to hear it. They can always just dump those into rules, and so you've got the rules committee where you can toss any bill that you don't have anywhere else to put it.
That's
So
right. They do seem to
uh,
put a lot down there.
Well, and one example is like I think the Judiciary Committee has been divided into some subcommittees.
Hmm.
And so there are some committees that are new, but then there are some that are divided further. And I don't know if that's because there was expected volumes of bills related to those matters, or if they just wanted opportunities to give more people leadership opportunities since there's a bigger majority.
That's true. They gotta have more thrones for the princes.
and most of these new committees too. Yeah, I think that's what you're going to say, Andy. Most of these committees too are like the quote unquote new ones are committees that they have periodically, right? So there are committees that they don't use every session, but periodically there is business that fits in that committee, and so they kind of revive it, put a group together to deal with that business, and then you won't see that committee again. Maybe for a few more sessions until a relevant piece of legislation comes up. So I don't think, even though they have a lot more committees than they had last time. I don't think any of them are truly like new.
Mm.
I think all the committees are committees that have existed in various legislative sessions, just not in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so one example of that of a committee they brought back is the States' Rights Committee, which they've not had for a few years. I don't know if that's because we've got a Democratic president now and a Republican majority here in the state house, but there's also all these redistricting committees, right, that they have once every 10 years. And to Bailey's earlier point, they split the Judiciary Committee into civil and criminal, but there's also the Criminal Justice and Corrections Committee that's separate from those two as well. So a lot of them get a little overlappy. Like there's general government and then government modernization and efficiency and county municipal government.
But there's a states' rights committee. I don't ever recall there being a states' rights
Yeah,
committee.
Sean Ashley tweeted about this a few days ago, and I want to say that it was there. It may be 4 years ago. Honestly, it may have been under the previous presidential administration.
Was it there in like 1964, 1968? Uh, was that the last time that we used it?
I am less interested in the fact that it's there and more interested in what bills will be assigned to it. Right? I haven't. I guess I can search on Legiscan for states' rights.
I'll tell you one that's going to be assigned to it is the gun bill. So there's Senator oh man, who's it from southwestern part of the state has got a bill that explicitly says this is a bill that would preempt all federal like laws as it relates to guns. And it's like, man, someone should tell him that you can't do that. You can't do that.
There's this whole governing document in federalism that tells us that nothing can prevent.
so
That's
yeah,
Senator Hamilton.
and it might actually use the words nullification, which again is a doctrine that has been repeatedly tested that doesn't hold water. At least, I mean, again, a legal scholar I am not, but I think nullification has lost, I think, every time it's been tried. So I imagine the states' rights committee will see a lot of that kind of stuff. Bills that are supposed to be largely symbolic. They may or may not get heard. They may or not pass. When they do, they'll be challenged in court and cost us a lot of money to defend.
So, as a reminder to listeners, you can find bills you can search them by keyword. I don't think you can do it on the legislature's website, but I use Legiscan, which is legiscan.com. It's free, and you can search for any state by just keywords. So as Scott was talking, I went to Legiscan and looked for the word preempt and found several bills. The one to which he's referring, the gun bill, is from Senator Hamilton. It's Senate Bill 631. I'm going to go in and like search for nullification now too.
I'm doing it as you speak.
I had a hunch. And what's fun about this is that, over the years, we have tracked a few keywords like sunscreen for listener, friend of the pod, Effie Rourke. And there are no bills involving the word sunscreen this year. However, as most of us know now, there is a bill involving the word Bigfoot. 2 words, actually. I searched with it pushed together. It is 2 words, Bigfoot. This does not refer to myself or Pat McFerrin or folks that wear a large size shoe. This is a bill to create a hunting license for Bigfoot. And I think this falls under well, I will say at first blush, this falls under the category of bills that make a splash but won't go anywhere. However, I think it's really a tourism bill, right? It's not. He specifically said it's not about hunting Bigfoot. It's not about killing Bigfoot. It's about capturing Bigfoot, and he's hoping to partner with the tourism bureau or department to like create some merch, right? And someone I follow on Twitter has a Bigfoot hunting license and some stickers from Florida or some other state. And so perhaps this is one of their creative ways to raise revenue.
I mean, that's what I heard. Some folks kind of going back and forth on Twitter about it, and they were kind of envisioning this as almost like a bachelor or bachelorette party thing that you'd buy like licenses for your whole crew and spend some time like in whatever part of the state that I guess the Sasquatch is supposed to live, and take some beer and say you went on a Bigfoot hunt. I guess I mean it's with that justification, it doesn't even make the top 10 of most ridiculous bills that I've seen filed in the Oklahoma State Legislature. So the Bigfoot hunting bill doesn't bother me. Doesn't bother me at all. There are several healthcare bills I don't have a full list of everything that we're going to be looking at in healthcare. The State Medical Association will follow those really closely and looks at those. But I did a quick search today looking for bills related specifically to Medicaid and came up with a couple interesting hits. So Speaker McCall, Speaker of the House, and kind of the head honcho, the head cheese, if you will, at the legislature. He and Senator Treat over in the Senate. Speaker McCall has 2 shell bills, House Joint Resolutions 1011 and 1012. They're just ballot titles right now, but they're constitutional amendments. One is called the Oklahoma Medicaid Act of 2021. The other was called the Oklahoma Medicaid Reform Act of 2021. Right now, these bills just have 2 pages, and essentially it would refer to the people for their approval or rejection a bill that would add an amendment to the Constitution of Oklahoma by adding a new Section 5 to read the Oklahoma Medicaid Reform Act, but no notes in the bill about what that would do. Also, Senator Representative Sean Roberts, rather, he's got House Joint Resolution 1041, which is also a constitutional amendment to repeal Medicaid expansion and
Of course he does.
undo Medicaid expansion that was approved by a razor-thin margin by the people of Oklahoma recently. So I don't know what those are about, but you can bet I'll be watching them closely.
So, do you guys know how many shell bills there are? I'm assuming there's also a record number of shell bills this year.
I don't know how many there are. I know there's a bunch. Now, obviously, shell bills you can only have in the House. The Senate is not allowed to file shell bills. So you can. It is kind of hard to. I don't have a good way. If somebody can tweet at me or text me or something, I don't have a good way to like immediately identify a shell bill. You have to like open it up and like, oh, this sounds like it does something major, but it's 3 lines long. That's a shell bill. Also, most of the shell bills are going to be carried by leadership, right? So this is going to be Speaker McCall, Leader Eccles. They're going to be the ones who have most of the shell bills because they kind of have their pulse on what they might need that vehicle for later in session.
Well, and for our new listeners, I think that's an important thing to learn and remember is that those shell bills may not get text on them until April or May because there are negotiations and conversations happening during session to assess how the majority bodies want to approach policy decisions, especially on something as big as the Medicaid program and how to fund it and different things. And so one day we'll wake up and read language in a bill after negotiations have happened behind the scenes on how the bodies want to approach a policy decision. And typically, if it's filed by someone like the Speaker of the House, it's likely going to be a measure that's going to carry a lot of weight that will likely move forward in the process.
And Bailey, I would throw in there like 100% to what you said, but also not only will we not see language for these bills until maybe April or May, sometimes you don't see language for these bills until 15 minutes before they're voted on in committee. I mean,
Yes.
that happens like it's not even a deal where like, oh, hammer out the language, then it'll be a week. Like especially bills that can be really contentious like this. I mean, they'll file the bill and move it to committee. I mean, literally minutes before they take a vote on it.
Yeah, and that's listeners. If you are interested in how to track legislation and some of the keywords, we published a blog yesterday on bill filing deadline that's about how to track legislation, and it includes a video that I made yesterday. That's a walkthrough of Legiscan as well as the legislative tracking stuff on the legislature's website, and it's 14 minutes long. It's hopefully helpful. But I mentioned in that blog post, Scott, to your point, that often language, particularly when it comes to important and contentious bills like the budget, potentially like the redistricting maps, they have a nasty habit of not releasing that information until hours or minutes before it's heard in committee and or voted on
On the floor.
on the floor, right? Which is nuts because this, and Bailey, I'm sure you have the same experience that whenever I try to write up a summary of the legislative process, your brain starts ticking off all the exceptions to the rules, right? Where it's like, well, here's how it happens, except that it doesn't so much of the time. There are so many times that they scoot around it. They will move bills direct to the floor that haven't gone through any committees. And it's like, how does that?
Because the important thing to remember is that the legislature decides, like on organization day, their rules of decorum. So they may have even put rules in place for this session that might give them in ways to go around things that typically fall in the way that they have done business in the past. So it gives them those kind of almost like scapegoats to be able to get around what the typical rules would be.
Yeah, and sometimes that could be for legitimate purposes, right? Like, let's say an emergency, such as a global pandemic, pops up in the middle of session, and they've got to very quickly pass some legislation. Fortunately, they were already in session; they could do that. Those things happen on occasion, but more often than not, we kind of know, days, week, months in advance what's going to happen. If you guys are cool, I'd like to. I've got a spreadsheet going. I've got some bills I wanted to mention, and that we will probably hear about at some point in the next 4 months, and we can happily chat about them as we go along. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
Great. All right. So first up on my list is Senate Bill 913 from Senator Daniels, which I believe will give the legislature the authority to not just approve administrative rules for state agencies, but to repeal them. And that was the new word that was added. And I think it's maybe a sleeper bill of interest for a lot of people. I need to reach out to like the Public Employees Association or someone like that to kind of see if this is a concern or if it's fine, right? I just happened to run into it under one of my search terms and thought that was interesting. Another one, and I'm sure Scott has feelings about this one, House Bill 1591 from Representative Provenzano would eliminate the statewide virtual charter school board and assign all of its duties to the State Department of Education. So I think this has been argued for a while, that why do we have the State Department of Education that oversees all of the public schools, and then we have this like shadow board that oversees just virtual charter schools?
I mean, and the argument is that charter schools are public schools. So if they are public schools, then why aren't they um, overseen by the elected body that oversees public institutions? So, and when I say elected body, I'm meaning the state superintendent. So if charter schools are truly public schools, then that argument tracks that. Why doesn't OSD oversee them?
Yeah. Senator Dom has a bunch of bills that will get news. Some of them already have. He's got another abortion heartbeat bill, which has been ruled unconstitutional many times here and elsewhere. And there's a bunch of other bills like that.
And listeners, you're going to read a lot of preemption bills. So that's something just to prepare for, is you're going to read bills that will try to restrict municipalities from being able to make different decisions on a lot of things. It doesn't mean that's going to advance in the process, but you're going to see a lot of bills filed in that way.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way that most people perhaps think about government is that the federal government makes laws for the whole country, and then states can make their laws, and they might be slightly more stringent. So the federal government legislation is generally non-specific and somewhat broad and overarching. Yeah. And then the states are like, okay, well, here's our rules on it. And then cities might be a little tighter still, right? Like more localized. But what we've seen in Oklahoma is a strong pushback against federal rules, saying, you can't do that. Only we can do that. And federal government, your laws were too restrictive. But at the same time, they want to tell cities that cities can't be more restrictive for things like mask mandates will come up this year. But in the past, things like plastic bag usage, right? Like there was a plastic bag bill a few years ago that the state preempted cities and said cities are not allowed to ban disposable plastic trash bags or like grocery sacks or something. Or I think there may have been one that said, cities can't ban soda pop, right? And as if it's just a funny thing to say you can't ban something. Does those preemption bills seem weird to you guys at all?
Yeah, they're always weird, right? And I shouldn't say they're always weird. And both sides do this, if we're being honest, right? Like at the moment, what we've seen a lot in Oklahoma is that, in some of our urban centers, specifically Oklahoma City and Tulsa, there's discussions about doing things like raising a minimum wage. And the state legislature has stepped in to say, no, you can't do that. But some of these preemption bills are responses to things that are talked about at the national level that are garner a lot of attention that no one is actually trying to do in Oklahoma. I mean, maybe Norman had a discussion about banning plastic bags, but I don't think that Oklahoma City or Tulsa ever has, right? New York City several years ago under Mayor Bloomberg, they passed a law limiting the size of sodas that you can get, and there was we're not going to let cities do that in Oklahoma. Well, nobody wanted to. No one's ever talked about that in Oklahoma. So these are bills that are oftentimes symbolic and as much about making a statement as they are about actually governing, right? And it's I mean the ones that we're going to see this year that are actually, I think, depending on what committees they're assigned to, can get contentious. Is one, Senator Dom has a bill that would prohibit cities from establishing mask mandates because I don't know if Senator Dom thinks that COVID is fake, or if he thinks that masks don't work, or if he just thinks that you shouldn't have to wear one because he thinks they're hot and uncomfortable. I don't know.
I think it's more of the government can't tell me what I can or can't do. The government can't tell me I'm going to walk into a building and how I need to be dressed to walk into a building.
So he's got his mask mandate preemption bill, but then Governor Stitt, I don't know, I have not seen if there is legislation to this effect, but Governor Stitt has at least talked about legislation that would essentially say individual school districts don't have the power to decide things like mask mandates, virtual versus in-person learning, and that there would be some sort of statewide policy that all the districts would have to follow, because the governor has been really harping on the need to get all of our kids back in in-person school, which in theory is absolutely what should happen, um, provided that it is safe. And provided that it is safe is doing a lot of work in that sentence. So those are two kind of preemption bills that I think will, or preemption, subjects, whatever you want to call it, that I think will get a lot of attention this session.
Well, and to your point, Scott, I think that over the next 4 years, we're going to see a lot of preemptive legislation. And I think I'm thinking even, Andy, to Senate Bill 913 that you were referencing earlier, because if this new administration tackles a lot of issues from the regulatory lens and adds more latitude for states to take advantage of different services, if that control is then given to the legislature to be able to decide what things the state can or can't take advantage of, it then prevents Oklahoma to be able to take full advantage of federal dollars or federal programs. And so it also takes that power away from the governor to then direct what's happening among agency bodies, right? And so I really do believe that this idea of there's a constant dissonance between the local control argument and then preventing people from being able to make those decisions, because even at our administrative level, like tying the hands of agencies to not be able to take their options into consideration is taking local control away, right? And so I think that's something that our listeners should pay very close attention to this legislative session, but over time, on what things are backhanded ways to prevent municipalities and even state agencies from being able to enact any kind of policies that come down from the federal level.
Yeah, that's very interesting to watch. Speaking of federal level stuff, there was a number of bills involving audits to elections. There was one, I think, from Senator Dom as well, and that would, I think, demand a recount. There's some bills about recounts. So any issue I think that has come up in the last 6 months, right, is going to be, there's a bill for it, whether it needs to be or not. And again, to Bailey's point earlier, a lot of these may not be heard. There's a few bills that seek to modify the date of like school board elections to help consolidate election days, which I think is a good move, right? Leader Eccles has one of those. That's actually why I reached out to him last night, because some of that stuff is real confusing and it'll get them onto a more regular schedule. When it comes to
And wouldn't it save money over time to not have as many elections?
Man, I said this to him last night, that if we could consolidate elections and have them just like 4 times a year, right? Quarterly, March, June, August, November, whatever, so that you've got time you can space out municipal elections and county elections and the school board elections, so they're not on the same, we don't want to have 20-page ballots for all the people who have ballot fatigue. But we could space them out and have room for primaries and general elections. And if we couple that with some kind of ranked choice voting or open primaries, then you could
consolidate even further.
Yeah, you could have primaries, but you wouldn't have to have primary runoffs, right? Which is always a silly thing, because in many cases you have 3 elections for 1 seat.
So, for example, I feel like the city council race for Ward 1 in Oklahoma City will end up being that way, because I got my ballot in the mail and there's about 8 or 9 people vying for that open seat. And so it's inevitable for a runoff to take place.
Right. The
So
chances of any one of them getting more than 50 is,
very slim.
but that's a great argument for ranked choice voting right there, right? Because you could get your ballot, and if you ranked them in order of preference, right? Like I like this person the most and this person second, and then everyone votes, then everyone's vote would count. And if someone gets more than 50%, they win. If no one person gets more than 50%, whoever was last, all of those votes get reallocated to their second choice votes, and then so on until someone gets more than 50%, which is a great way to do it. And a number of other cities, including New York City, the largest city in the country, now use ranked choice voting for that very reason.
You know who ranked choice voting is not great for, Andy?
Who?
The parties.
Well, yes. And, I mean, so there's some states, including Texas, that use ranked choice voting for the party primaries, right? Because primaries are essentially primaries are publicly funded popularity contests for political parties, right? Like it's just Republicans getting to pick Republicans, it's Democrats getting to pick Democrats to put forth their party's candidate, but we have to pay for it regardless. And there are at least 2 bills I've seen that would actually affect that, where it would, a lot of people complain that if a seat only has 2 candidates, but they're both from the same party. For example, let's say there's 2 Republicans that are running for a state House seat, no Democrats, no independents. Then that representative is chosen in the primary election,
Right.
and that means only Republican voters were allowed to vote in it.
And that happens very often for Oklahoma.
Yes, yes. And it happens on the other side too, right? You could have only Democrats run or something. And so there's a couple of bills that would say if that's the case, if there are only members from one party, whether it's, let's say there's 5 Republicans that all run for one seat, then there would be a primary, and then the top 2 from that would go to the general. And if there's only 2 candidates that file, they both automatically. So regardless, you end up with 2 candidates on the ballot for the general, so that everyone can vote on who actually will hold that seat, which I think is a pretty smart bill. We'll see if it gets a hearing, but I think it's a smart bill.
Well, and even if we needed to experiment on, how this works, we do have nonpartisan elections that take place. And so those might be the best ways to get a demonstration on how ranked choice voting works to then get people's comfort levels to apply them to our partisan races.
Yeah. Bailey, while we're talking something, well, first of all, I want to say one of those primary bypass bills I just mentioned is House Bill 1844 from Representative Fugate. I see it on my screen here. So if you're looking for it, that's one of them, but I know there's more than that. As I've looked through these, Bailey, a lot of bills I've noticed are duplicative, like the same language in 2 or more bills from 2 or more legislators. Is that normal? Is that pretty common? And
It
why?
is. It's common for strategy purposes. And so when you're working with multiple bill authors and you have multiple vehicles at play for legislation, it gives, particularly, this is more strategy on the lens of organizations and advocacy groups that are pushing for a specific type of legislation. And so if you have multiple bills, then you can see which authors would be best to carry it, who's most likely to get it through certain committees. Sometimes even different bills are assigned to different committees, right? So all of those, or they may have 2 different paths. Maybe there may be other priorities on the Senate side. So there may be opportunity for the bill to advance on the House side. And so you have a House version and a Senate version to see which one has the greatest possibility of moving through the process. And so it doesn't always have to be a bad thing that there's multiple versions of a bill, but it's typically a tactic to figure out what's the best path to get that bill through the process.
Yeah, I'll highlight two examples of this. One, they're both from the House, actually. So House Bill 2103 and 2623 are identical. They both create the Oklahoma Restoration of Voting Rights Act, modify voting rights of certain convicted felons, blah, blah, blah. It's the same ballot title and the same language. 2103 is authored by Representative Turner, who's newly elected, new to the legislature. And then 2623 is represented by or authored by Representative Cindy Munson, who's been around for a few terms and has a different type of relationship. And in that scenario, I can see exactly what you were talking about, Bailey, where it Representative Turner's new, and when you're new, it's tough to get legislation through. And whoever was backing this, it could be just them, but I'm sure there's groups that are in support of this. It's I think politically strategic, right, to have Representative Munson also carry a version of it in a very different way. There are three House joint resolutions. And listeners, remember, a bill is like a statutory change, it's like a regular law. Joint resolutions are basically a bill that will become a ballot initiative, or not a ballot initiative, but a ballot measure, a legislatively referred ballot measure. So HJR 1042, 1043, and 1044 are all authored by Speaker McCall. They all deal with the initiative petition process, and they all have the exact same language right now. So when you look at it, it's the same, and it's only one minor change. It changes the words percentum to a actual percentage. So it deals with the number of signatures you have to collect. My hunch on this is they have these, it's not really a shell bill because there's some language there, but that they have these joint resolutions out there so they can swap out the language down the road, either to try to confuse us as we advocate against a change, right? Or as a way to um, put something else in there that has nothing to do with whatever that bill has to do with right now. Does that sound like a reasonable?
Well, or they could be trying to gauge their caucus on what paths are most feasible. So, for example, I know a couple years ago there were different bills around changing the state question 640 threshold. And some had it at, these are the number of, some had it like, I think like at 2/3. Another bill had it at 60%. And so different members felt, different perspectives on what that threshold should be. And so that's an example of how lawmakers or even caucuses can use different versions of similar legislation to see which path might work best to move forward. But also, you see different bills. You see sometimes the same or similar language filed by multiple lawmakers because oftentimes lawmakers are filing things that they are passionate about and they care about or that constituents have asked them to file. So there may not even be coordination on lawmaker A and lawmaker B on the same issue. Like, for example, years ago, there were multiple bills around the EITC, but that's because different advocacy organizations and even just different lawmakers themselves wanted to take that issue on. And so they filed legislation around that bill. And so none of them knew, oh, I didn't realize such and such on this side of the aisle or this person on the other side of the chamber, or even my colleague in my own caucus, may have also filed that same bill. So sometimes it's just members filing things that they find as a priority because if there's multiple people talking about the same things and then there's a path forward on at least one of those bills, lawmakers can take credit. They can say, I helped to advance and I helped to move policy on X issue. So, I mean, that's another lens to why people may see the same language in multiple bills by multiple lawmakers. Or you may see in the case that Andy brought up, one lawmaker or one person in leadership may have 3 or 4 bills that have similar language, but maybe used in different ways.
Yeah, on these three bills from McCall, the bill title just says constitutional amendment, clarifying language, ballot title. So it's like as generic as it could possibly be, and for all three of those. But there are a number of bills to highlight your other point about having different thresholds. So there are a number of bills that deal with the initiative petition process that would change the threshold for passage at the ballot. So right now, if an initiative petition, becomes a state question, and you get 50% plus one vote, right? So, we'll say a simple majority, then it passes, which is normal. That's how most elections work. They are one of their tactics to kind of clamp down on the initiative petition process. And we may have mentioned one of these previously, but they're looking at raising that threshold. So there's a couple of bills that say it would have to be 55%. Some bills say it have to be 60%. Some bills say it have to be a 2/3, 67% of voters to support it in order for it to be passed. And we heard 61st. I would assume that's where they're going to end up, but all of them, this is, I think, in a direct response to things like Medicaid expansion that passed with a very narrow margin, which probably also is part of the justification for some bills that add in statewide recounts if the margin of passage is like less than 1% or less than 1/2 of 1%, some of those things. And so we'll be watching those all. Any kind of change to the election process, we'll be watching very closely.
Well, and Oklahoma is one of the unique states that give the people the opportunity to participate in the policymaking process. And so some people argue that the rise in number of state questions, but also like the passage of certain state questions is a reflection that the legislature is not doing what the people want it to do, right? And so that's not a good feeling for the legislature. Or, there's this conversation about whether there's a rural urban dynamic and how legislation is being passed through that process, right? And so some are even viewing these changes as a way to empower the votes of folks in rural communities, right? And so it's just all interesting to see different takes of why the election process needs to be changed, particularly on state questions.
Yeah, I this whole not this whole conversation that we're having here, but like this whole debate about changing the initiative petition process is really frustrating to me. And that it's like, it's I mean, to me, it's a great example of what the real objective here is, that legislators don't like it when people of Oklahoma preempt them and do things that the legislature didn't want to do. Right? Like that's it's not that the initiative process needs to be changed or needs to be updated or needs to be improved. They just don't like it. Right? They don't like it, and they are trying to think of ways to justify changing it. And they've decided to exploit the urban rural divide that already exists and take action to kind of pit Oklahomans against each other in order to justify this thing that they want to do. I mean, to me, this initiative petition process stuff is like it's politics at its worst, and it pisses me off.
That's fair. I'm on an email list for a nationwide organization, the BISC, BISC, Ballot Initiative something, and they have noted this across the country, right? That where Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, that's what it is. And if states that have this option, they've done it in recent years. And like Utah is a good example, where they passed Medicaid expansion, they passed medical marijuana, they actually passed independent redistricting, and so we've seen a lot of this change. I'll say progress, which I know is like a liberal buzzword, but like the possibility of moving our democracy forward is indeed progress. And if it's happening at the ballot instead of through the legislature, that doesn't necessarily mean that the system is broken. It just means that, well, I guess it means it's broken in a different way. Speaking of medical marijuana, there are two bills from Representative Fettgetter, who is, one of the, I'll say, champions of the cannabis industry in the state legislature. Um, one would, Scott, I want to hear your response to this. House Bill 2179 would establish medical marijuana licenses for animal patients. In case you've got like a depressed pig. Hey, but maybe, you guys just heard my dog Walter running by barking outside. I could get this dog some dope. Maybe he'll calm down.
Just give him an edible.
Yeah.
Are you gonna like test the dog's urine to make sure that they're giving it to the dog? Are you gonna put it in like dog food that tastes nasty to people? So people, I'm just curious. I'm curious how that's gonna work and why. I mean, don't get me wrong, my dog's crazy. Maybe she would benefit from some weed. I've never.
I'm just picturing our two dogs like hanging out like Cheech and Chong now. But
Are there other states that have allowed something of this nature to happen? So I wonder what the origin is. And that's another reminder to our listeners that you may hear of bills that you're going to also hear about in other states. So that's another trend that happens during legislative sessions is you have national organizations or entities that will work with lawmakers across the country to file certain pieces of legislation. So I do wonder what the origin of this particular bill is.
some quick definitions. Animal patient does not include livestock or food animals. So it's, no animal that is raised or kept for profit. So pigs, horses, cows, fish, those kind of things. Um, I assume it is for like pets because it goes through the department of or the veterinary medical examiners board because you can get like Prozac for your dog and stuff if it there's lots of medications that your pets may need. I assume it's just since we are treating marijuana as a medical pharmaceutical that this would just extend it to other animals. Perhaps more notably than animal patients with some reefer is that Representative Fetgetter also has House Bill 1961, which I think decriminalizes most marijuana possession for anyone over the age of 21. I don't, my reading, I need to ask someone like Brian Jones or Ryan Kiesel is if it's an actual legalization or if this is simply a decriminalization.
Interesting. Yeah, Brian would be the one to ask about that. Another thing I'm curious to see, and I don't think we've talked about this yet, is how many bills we have that aren't just adapted from other states, but how many bills are being pushed by outside organizations. We've talked about that before on the show. We usually talk about at the beginning of every session, but like, one kind of group that's famous for this is the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a group that goes around. They have like 20 bills that are essentially the same that they go around and try to get legislatures to pass in states all over the country. Oklahoma is notorious as being one of the states that passes the most of these. What do we call them? Like identical bills that are kind of go around being passed from state to state. We passed
Model
them.
legislation.
Yeah, model. There we go. I was like, that is the term of art that was escaping me. We are notorious for passing lots and lots of model legislation. So I'm curious to see how many of the bills we talked about today wind up actually being those. Not bills that were dreamed up by their authors, but bills that their authors, went to a convention or something, and a representative was there and said, "Hey, you look like you might be interested in carrying my bill that does some random thing that's probably not important to the people of your state, but we're going to pass it anyway."
Well, I do want to bring up one specific bill that's alarming, but is a reflection of model legislation that we're seeing across the country. So, President Trump, before he left office, passed the 1776 commission bill that would prevent school districts from talking about I believe it's the 1669 project. I probably have the year wrong.
1619.
69, I'm sorry, 1619 project that talks about Black heritage and the um, experience of the Black diaspora starting at well before even slavery, right? And the response to that is that's viewed as unpatriotic and divisive. And so the legislation would repeal what would prevent schools from talking about divisive subjects. Well, when President Biden took office, one of the executive orders repealed that um, policy. And now we're seeing states try to supplant it in their legislatures. And so Senator Shane Jett has one of those model legislations that would prevent schools from talking about things that are deemed divisive. And so things like race, some of the things that we're seeing even over the summer with Black Lives Matter and the protests that happened in or the mob rioting insurrectionists at the Capitol. So all of those things would be deemed divisive and schools would be prevented from talking about real history. And so I think that's a major concern, but we're seeing that legislation show up across the country because I believe it's on Arkansas's agenda as well.
Yeah, there are several bills that are along those lines this year that kind of say like, anything that says that they couch themselves as being like anti-discrimination bills, but it says like any bill that assumes that someone because of their race or sex or ethnicity is somehow like basically like if if based on their race or sex or ethnicity that means they're racist or somehow like complicit with racism, that we can't talk about that, you can't teach that, nothing should promote that, which is like a just a very uh, defensive stance, right? And Scott, you and I were texting earlier about Rand Paul. Well, I think all three of us were texting about Rand Paul's statement that was like basically like, well, I don't like that they're calling us racists, and it's like, is that if methinks thou dost protest too much, right? About
But it's even this erasure, right, of history. And so I think that's part of what has fueled this tension in um, American culture is these ideas that we want to honor, for example, Dr. King and paint him as this nonviolent figure and quote all his fluffy things, even though he was strongly, an advocate for economic justice and he was pro union and he organized workers, right? And so to not talk about those things whitewashes history. And that's dangerous because then we're not walking in truth and freedom, but instead we're continuing this trend of couching what it means to be a patriot and what it means to be American through this lens of white supremacy. And that's a huge problem that if we're truly moving forward and becoming, a race forward country and state that cares about people, then we have to be able to reconcile with the truth even when it's painful. And so it's very damaging to say we can't talk about history because it doesn't feel good.
And it's one of those things like what Rand Paul specifically was saying is he wasn't even like, when you listen to President Biden's inaugural address, he didn't call anybody a racist, right? He said several times in different ways, like systemic racism is bad, and that is something we have to wrestle with. And Rand Paul's response to that was, I mean, hell, he's basically calling me a racist, and it's like, okay, he didn't, but the fact that you took it that way, what is that? You're kind of proving the point, right? Like your defensiveness is proving the need that we have to talk about this stuff, right? Um, and it is hard and it is painful. And um, yeah, I think if what it's stuff that we have to address in our society, if we're ever going to move forward. And it's particularly, it is important all across, the country, and it's no less important in a state like Oklahoma, where we have, what, at one point, Bailey, how many all black towns do we have in Oklahoma, and how many of them are left?
Well, like a couple of dozen all black towns. We have more than any other state in the nation, and then we still have all black towns functioning. I mean, the first law on the books was um, segregation in the state, right? And even it's ironic that somebody who is a member of a tribal nation is proposing legislation to prevent truthful conversations on our past, because what does that mean even in conversations of divisiveness? Does it mean that we can't talk about the Trail of Tears in the way that we talk about um, like the land run? Are we not supposed to talk about stolen lands? You know what I mean? And so it creates this kind of weird. Um, it's it creates this. What word am I trying to use? It could be all bad to say that we can't talk about anything divisive, that we can't talk about race, gender. Like, can we not talk about women's suffrage? Like, where are the boundaries even to what is history? So
Right. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it doesn't happen and it's not important.
Preach. It's going to be an interesting session, guys. It's going to be an interesting session.
but to the point we were raising earlier, like there's going to be a lot of different bills that we're going to see from different parts of the country to either make policies and ideas that were pushed under the Trump administration, policies at the state level, or things that try to block and prevent federal influence on states. So that's definitely something we have to be watching for.
Yeah. As we wind down here, I just want to mention two things that will indubitably come up this year. One is an extension of or a change to the Open Meetings Act to allow virtual meetings. What that looks like remains to be seen. There's 1, 2, 3, 7, 8 bills, I think, that deal with this. That, as we talked about earlier, some extended through the end of the year, some extended through next spring, some extended 4 years, some extended permanently. We know that Leader Eccles has said that making some substantial changes to the Open Meetings Act is one of his legacy issues he wants to accomplish before he leaves the legislature, before he terms out. And so I'm going to be watching his bill the most closely. But I think Pro Tem Treat also filed one today, and so we'll see exactly what comes out of all of that.
But the great thing is there's conversations for permanent change going forward, so that we don't have to go back to these moments of, we have the temporary policy and then we have this weird gap to then get us back to where we were. And so I'm looking forward, and I'm hopeful that lawmakers will make that permanent approach to help give continuity to governments and organizations who have to abide by this important law.
That's right. Senator Treat's bill actually even requires, it goes a step further and even requires that public entities, wherever possible, live stream their meetings for the public to watch, just like the legislature does their committee meetings and floor proceedings, which I think is admirable, right? Like, I can see it that getting a lot of pushback. It says where high-speed internet exists and where it's possible, but there will be city councils that just set up a webcam across the room or something. You won't be able to really see or hear anything, but I mean, it's a step in the right direction, right? Maybe sometime
transparency is always good.
That's right. One of these days we'll have an infrastructure week where it's all about digital stuff, where we can actually get some high-speed internet and better equipment out to these rural areas so they can participate and do things like podcast virtually from the safety of our own homes, like we're doing right this very minute. Okay, and then we'll end on the one issue that we don't know yet, and that is the state budget, right? And we will undoubtedly cover this a lot more as the session bears on. But just so listeners know, at this point, we don't know anything, right? That'll come. Check back in like
And we
April.
won't until the 4th week of May.
Right. Yeah. 2 hours before they vote on it, the press corps will be scampering around the Capitol trying to get their hands on it, as will the Democrats. And then there'll be great consternation, lots of waving arms and frustration, and then it'll pass. And we'll all go on vacation, or like we did this year, just go home and sit there.
Well, but a new dynamic that is in this legislature that hasn't been in previous legislatures is the supermajority that exists within both chambers. So theoretically, and I say theoretically because there's always factions within parties. And so even people within the same parties don't always have the same views on how priorities and dollars should be spent. But in theory, Republicans don't need any Democratic votes in order to pass a budget. And that's the first time, because before it was they needed, I think, at least 1 or 2 Democratic members to reach those thresholds. But now their majority has grown to the point where theoretically Republicans can do everything unilaterally. So it'll be interesting to see how those conversations shake out. And there's usually a blame game of, right, Republicans say Democrats aren't doing this, Democrats say Republicans aren't doing that. But now, since there is a full supermajority, it'll be interesting to see how the majority is able to make those decisions for the budget.
And it'll be just interesting to see, where those fissures might happen in the legislature. If they don't show up this year, they definitely will next year as we move into an election cycle, I'm sure. So, all right, Scott Bailey, thank you for being here.
Thank you as always, sir.
I echo that.
Listeners, thank you as well. Again, be sure to go to our website and subscribe to our mailing list. I promise not to spam you. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at Let's Fix This Okay. Tell your friends about the podcast. It'll be very important over the next few months as we get into the legislative session. Lots of important content. Not that it's not anyway, but even more. All right. Well, on that note, decisions are made by those who show up. Have a great week.